Winter settles over Shelbyville, Kentucky, with the kind of cold that makes old houses creak and groan. Blackwood Hall stands against the gray December sky, its white columns rising from frozen lawns like monuments to a different era. The Victorian mansion stretches across 5,000 square feet, built in 1866 when the Civil War wounds were still fresh and America was learning to stand again. But this house doesn't hold Civil War memories. The ghosts that walk these halls wear white suits and string ties, and they smell of 11 herbs and spices that change the world. In 1959, a 69-year-old man named Harlan Sanders purchased this property with money he didn't really have. He just lost everything. Highway planners had rerouted Interstate 75 away from his restaurant in Corbin, Kentucky, effectively killing his business overnight. One day, he was serving travelers and making a living. The next day, traffic disappeared like water down a drain. He auctioned off everything he owned just to pay his debts. When the dust settled, he had a Social Security check for $105 a month and not much else. Most men his age would have accepted defeat, found a small apartment somewhere, and waited quietly for the end. Harlan Sanders bought a mansion instead. The purchase made no logical sense. Blackwood Hall wasn't some modest retirement cottage. This was a statement property, the kind of place that demanded upkeep and property taxes and constant attention. But Sanders wasn't buying a house. He was buying a launching pad for the most unlikely business comeback in American history. He'd spent the previous few years driving across the country in a white suit, sleeping in his car, cooking chicken in restaurant kitchens, trying to convince anyone who would listen that his pressure-cooked chicken recipe was worth paying him a nickel for every piece they sold. Most people thought he was crazy. A 65-year-old man with a white goatee, driving from town to town, offering to cook free chicken dinners if restaurateurs would just taste his recipe and consider his franchise proposal. It sounded like desperation masquerading as entrepreneurship. But Sanders wasn't desperate. He was absolutely certain. He'd been perfecting that chicken recipe since the 1930s, back when he ran a service station in Corbin and started serving meals to travelers. He'd discovered that cooking chicken in a pressure cooker with a specific blend of seasonings created something magical, something people would drive hours to taste. He knew he had something valuable. He just needed the rest of the world to understand it too. So he bought Blackwood Hall, not as a home, but as proof that he believed in his own future. The mansion became his headquarters, his statement of intent, his middle finger to everyone who thought he should retire and fade away. From this Victorian house in Shelbyville, Sanders built something that would eventually span the globe. He set up shop on the property and opened the Claudia Sanders Dinner House, named after his wife. This wasn't some small operation. Sanders constructed a 25,000 square foot restaurant that could seat 700 people. He designed it to showcase his chicken, his way, with his recipes and his standards. While he was out traveling and signing franchise agreements, the dinner house became the mothership, the place where people could taste the authentic Sanders experience. The restaurant proved that his vision worked. People didn't just like his chicken. They loved it enough to fill 700 seats night after night. By 1964, Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises were operating across the country and starting to spread internationally. Sanders had created something unprecedented. He'd taken a Southern cooking technique and a secret blend of seasonings and turned them into a business model that worked in Utah and California, and eventually England and Japan. The white suit and the colonel persona that he'd adopted were becoming iconic. Children recognized him on the street. The goatee and the string tie were turning into a logo more recognizable than most corporate symbols. At 74 years old, Harlan Sanders had accomplished what most entrepreneurs only dream about. He'd built a brand. That's when he made the decision that would haunt the rest of his life. A group of investors approached Sanders with an offer to buy Kentucky Fried Chicken. They offered $2 million. In 1964, that was serious money. Sanders was 74. He'd already beaten the odds by building a successful business at an age when most people were long retired. $2 million represented security, legacy, freedom from the constant travel and negotiation that came with managing a growing franchise operation. He could focus on the dinner house, spend time with Claudia, and let someone else handle the corporate expansion. So he sold. He kept Blackwood Hall and the dinner house. He retained a lifetime salary as a quality control inspector and brand spokesperson. But he sold the company, the recipes, the trademark, and ultimately his control over his own creation. The buyers knew what they had. Within a few years, Kentucky Fried Chicken was going public and making the investors fortunes that dwarfed what they'd paid Sanders. The company's value exploded. By the early 1970s, the franchises that Sanders had started were generating hundreds of millions in revenue. The investors who bought KFC for $2 million were sitting on assets worth $285 million. The math was brutal and clear. Sanders had sold out at a fraction of what his creation was actually worth. He'd been outmaneuvered, outnegotiated, and left watching from the sidelines while others became wealthy beyond measure from his recipe. But wealth wasn't what ultimately broke Colonel Sanders. What destroyed him was watching a Kentucky Fried Chicken change. The new owners were businessmen, not cooks. They looked at Sanders' recipes and saw inefficiency. They analyzed his cooking methods and identified corners that could be cut. They studied the 11 herbs and spices and figured out cheaper alternatives. They weren't trying to be malicious. They were trying to maximize profits, which is what corporate owners do. But every change was a knife in Sanders' back. Every deviation from his original recipe felt like a betrayal. He'd created something he was proud of, something with integrity and quality, and he was watching it get diluted and cheapened in real time. Sanders still had his role as quality control inspector and company spokesperson, which meant he was obligated to visit franchises and promote the brand. But now he was promoting something he increasingly didn't believe in. He'd walk into a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant and taste chicken that didn't meet his standards. He'd see cooking methods that violated his principles. And he'd have to smile and shake hands and tell customers that this was authentic Colonel Sanders chicken, even though he knew it wasn't. The white suit that had been a symbol of pride became a costume he had to wear while endorsing a product he no longer controlled. His face was on every bucket, but his recipes were being ignored. By 1974, Sanders had reached his breaking point. He started speaking publicly about his dissatisfaction with Kentucky Fried Chicken's quality. He gave interviews where he criticized the company for abandoning his standards. He called the gravy wallpaper paste and said the chicken was nothing like what I used to serve. He wasn't subtle about his disappointment. For a corporate brand that had built its entire identity around the Colonel Sanders persona, this was a catastrophic problem. The living embodiment of their brand was publicly trashing their product. Something had to give. Kentucky Fried Chicken sued Sanders. The lawsuit sought $122 million and accused him of violating his contract by disparaging the company and damaging the brand. $122 million. The number was chosen to be devastating, to make it clear that KFC could financially destroy Sanders if they chose to. Here was an 84-year-old man who had created the entire enterprise being sued by the corporation that existed only because of his recipe. The irony was vicious. Sanders countersued, claiming the company had breached its agreement by deviating from his quality standards. The legal battle was ugly in public, and it exposed the fundamental conflict at the heart of the franchise model. Who owns quality when a brand is sold? The case settled. Sanders received approximately $1 million and an agreement that he could continue operating the Claudia Sanders Dinner House without further legal interference from Kentucky Fried Chicken. But there was a condition. He couldn't use the Kentucky Fried Chicken name or trademark in connection with his own restaurant. The company he created, the brand he built, the name that had been synonymous with his identity for decades, all of it was off limits. He was legally separated from his own legacy. The dinner house remained successful, but Sanders had to watch as Kentucky Fried Chicken continued to grow globally, continued to use his face and his recipes, however modified, while he was contractually prevented from claiming any ownership over the brand. The settlement money meant nothing to Sanders by that point. He wasn't fighting for financial gain. He was fighting for his name, for his reputation, for the right to maintain standards on something he'd created, and he lost. The legal system had determined that when you sell a company, you sell everything, including your ability to criticize what the buyers do with your creation. Sanders could keep cooking at the dinner house. He could wear his white suit and greet customers and maintain his own little kingdom in Shelbyville. But the larger empire, the global franchise that bore his face, was beyond his control forever. Sanders lived another 6 years after the settlement. He continued working at the dinner house almost until the end. He'd wake up early, put on the white suit, and spend his days greeting customers and supervising the kitchen. He remained particular about quality, about cooking times and seasoning blends and presentation. The dinner house became his proof that his original vision still worked, that chicken cooked his way could still draw crowds and earn respect. But he was also watching Kentucky Fried Chicken expand to thousands of locations worldwide, watching his face become one of the most recognizable corporate symbols on earth, watching billions of pieces of chicken get sold under his name using recipes he didn't approve. In December 1980, Sanders was diagnosed with acute leukemia. The disease moved quickly. Within days, it was clear he didn't have much time. He was 90 years old, which is a full life by any measure, but Sanders hadn't slowed down. He'd been working, planning, staying active right up until the diagnosis. The leukemia didn't give him a chance to prepare. On December 16, 1980, Harlan Sanders died in Louisville. His body lay in state at the Kentucky State Capitol, where mourners filed past paying respects to the man who'd put Kentucky on the global culinary map. Governor John Y. Brown, Jr., who had been one of the early investors who bought Kentucky Fried Chicken from Sanders, delivered part of the eulogy. The symbolism was heavy. One of the men who'd profited enormously from Sanders' creation was now praising him at his funeral. Sanders was buried in Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville, wearing his white suit. The obituaries celebrated him as an American success story, an entrepreneur who'd built an empire from scratch. They talked about his determination, his comeback at 65, his creation of a global brand. They mostly skipped over the legal battles, the bitter disputes about quality, the frustration of watching his creation evolve beyond his control. The narrative of Colonel Sanders as triumphant capitalist hero was cleaner and more marketable than the messier truth about artistic control and corporate ownership. Blackwood Hall remained in family hands after Sanders died. Claudia lived there until her death in 1996. The mansion had been their headquarters, their home, their base of operations for building an empire. But it had also witnessed Sanders' frustration, his legal battles, his gradual realization that selling Kentucky Fried Chicken had cost him more than he'd gained. The Victorian walls had absorbed decades of phone calls with franchise owners, arguments with corporate lawyers, quiet moments when an old man in a white suit wondered if he'd made the right choice back in 1964. The Claudia Sanders Dinner House continued operating after Sanders died. It remained popular, still serving chicken prepared according to the Colonel's original methods, still filling seats with locals and tourists who wanted to taste something closer to the authentic Sanders experience. But in 1999, fire tore through the restaurant. The 25,000 square foot building that Sanders had built as proof of his vision burned. The fire investigators determined it was electrical, nothing suspicious, just the kind of disaster that can destroy decades of work in an afternoon. The restaurant was rebuilt, reopened, and continued operating, but it wasn't quite the same. The original building had been Sanders' creation, designed to his specifications, built with his money and his vision. The rebuilt version was a reproduction, accurate but not original. Blackwood Hall eventually went on the market. The asking price was initially $8 million, reflecting the property's size, historic value, and association with Colonel Sanders. But the house didn't sell. The price dropped to $6.5 million. Still no buyers. The Kentucky mansion market wasn't exactly booming, and Blackwood Hall came with complications. The property's association with Colonel Sanders was simultaneously its greatest asset and biggest liability. Buyers who wanted a historic mansion weren't necessarily interested in living in a shrine to fast food history, and KFC enthusiasts, who might have been interested in owning Sanders' former home, generally weren't in the market for multi-million-dollar estates. Then came the trademark disputes. Yum! Brands, the current owner of Kentucky Fried Chicken, maintains aggressive control over the Colonel Sanders trademark. They own the image, the name, the likeness. They defend those rights vigorously. Any commercial use of Sanders' image or name requires their approval and often their licensing fees. This created complex legal questions around Blackwood Hall and the dinner house. How much could the property owners reference the Colonel Sanders connection when marketing the estate? What about the restaurant? The legal ambiguity made potential buyers nervous. Nobody wants to purchase a property that comes with potential trademark litigation from a multinational corporation. The asking price dropped again, this time to $4.9 million. The 45% reduction from the original asking price reflected the reality that Blackwood Hall had become a difficult property to sell. It was too expensive for most local buyers, too complicated for investors, and too historically specific for the luxury home market. The mansion that Sanders had bought in 1959 as a statement of faith in his future had become a white elephant, valuable in theory but practically unsellable in a market that didn't know what to do with it. Meanwhile, Kentucky Fried Chicken continued thriving as a global brand. The company operates over 25,000 locations worldwide. Annual revenue exceeds tens of billions of dollars. The Colonel Sanders image appears on every bucket, every advertisement, every corporate document. The white suit and goatee are trademarked and protected. Harlan Sanders' face is one of the most widely recognized corporate symbols on Earth, appearing in countries and contexts he never could have imagined when he was driving around America in the 1950s, cooking chicken dinners in restaurant kitchens. The value generated by his recipe and his image is effectively incalculable. It's woven into global culture at this point, but Sanders himself sold out for $2 million in 1964, received $1 million in settlement money in 1974, and died, having spent his final years legally prevented from criticizing the quality of chicken sold under his name. His estate didn't inherit rights to the ongoing KFC empire. His family didn't receive royalties from the billions of chicken pieces sold globally. The people who got wealthy from Kentucky Fried Chicken were investors and corporate executives, not the man who created the recipe and built the original brand. The contrast between Sanders' wealth and the wealth generated by his creation is staggering. The investors who bought KFC for $2 million turned around and took the company public, making hundreds of millions. Later, sales and mergers created billionaires. The current value of the KFC brand as part of Yum! Brands' portfolio is measured in the tens of billions. And the man whose face appears on every bucket died comfortable but not wealthy, having fought legal battles against his own creation, having watched his quality standards get compromised for profit margins, having been forced to rename his own restaurant to avoid trademark disputes. This isn't a story about business success. It's a story about the price of selling something you created. Sanders built Kentucky Fried Chicken from nothing. He developed the recipe through years of experimentation. He created the franchise model through hundreds of personal pitches and demonstrations. He turned himself into a brand through sheer force of personality and relentless work ethic. And then he sold it, believing that $2 million in a consulting role would let him maintain influence over his creation while enjoying financial security. He was wrong. The fundamental lesson of Colonel Sanders' life isn't about entrepreneurship or determination or American dreams. It's about ownership and control and what happens when you separate a creator from their creation. Sanders learned that you can't sell a company and keep its soul. You can't hand over trademarks and expect to maintain quality standards. You can't become an employee of your own brand and retain the authority to protect what you built. The corporate structure doesn't work that way. Once you sell, you're out. Your opinions become suggestions. Your standards become optional. Your name becomes a marketing asset that others control. Blackwood Hall stands in Shelbyville today, still for sale, still waiting for someone willing to pay $4.9 million for a piece of complicated history. The white columns are elegant. The Victorian architecture is impressive. The property sprawls across grounds that Sanders once walked, planning his empire, fighting his battles, watching his creation grow beyond his control. But the mansion is just a building now. The Claudia Sanders Dinner House operates nearby, still serving chicken, still attracting customers who want something closer to the original experience. And somewhere in Yum, Brands' corporate offices, executives make decisions about how to use Colonel Sanders' image in their latest marketing campaigns, never having met the man, never having tasted his original recipes, never having heard him complain about gravy that resembled wallpaper paste. The story of Colonel Sanders and Kentucky Fried Chicken gets told as inspiration. Man loses everything at 65, rebuilds through determination, creates global empire. The ending is supposed to be triumphant. But the real ending is more complicated. Sanders did rebuild. He did create an empire. And then he sold it and spent his final decades fighting against what it became, prohibited by law from claiming ownership over his own name, watching others profit from his creation while he cooked chicken in Shelbyville and wondered what would have happened if he'd never sold. There's no villain in this story. The investors who bought Kentucky Fried Chicken weren't evil. They were businessmen making logical business decisions. Corporate optimization, cost reduction, market expansion, these are standard practices. The lawyers who sued Sanders were protecting their clients' trademark rights, which is their job. Yum! Brands defending the Colonel Sanders image against unauthorized use is responsible corporate behavior. Everyone acted rationally according to their incentives. And yet the sum total of all these rational decisions was that the man who created Kentucky Fried Chicken died bitter, legally separated from his own legacy, watching his face sell chicken he didn't approve of while prohibited from speaking honestly about it. The tragedy isn't that Sanders died poor. He didn't. He remained comfortable until the end. The tragedy is that he died powerless, watching something he'd created with his own hands get modified and distributed according to principles he didn't agree with, legally prevented from claiming ownership over his own reputation. The white suit that had represented pride and quality became a costume worn by impersonators at franchise openings. The recipe that he'd perfected over decades got simplified and standardized for corporate efficiency. The name that had been his identity became intellectual property owned by strangers. Blackwood Hall represents all of this. The mansion stands as a monument to Sanders' ambition and success. It also stands as a reminder that success can be hollow when you lose control of what you created. Sanders bought this property in 1959 with borrowed money and absolute faith that his chicken recipe would change the world. He was right. His recipe did change the world. It generated billions in wealth, fed billions of people, created thousands of jobs, and became woven into global culture. But Sanders himself was gradually written out of his own story, reduced to a trademarked image, a marketing symbol, a face on a bucket that sells chicken he wouldn't have recognized as his own. The asking price of $4.9 million for Blackwood Hall seems simultaneously too high and strangely appropriate. Too high because it's a difficult property in a slow market with legal complications. Appropriate because what's the right price for owning the headquarters where an American icon built and then lost control of his empire? How do you value the house where Colonel Sanders lived through his greatest triumph and his most bitter defeat? What's a monument to complicated success worth in a market that prefers simple stories? Kentucky winters are cold, and Blackwood Hall faces another season waiting for a buyer who may never come. The white columns need maintenance. The Victorian rooms need heating. The property taxes come due regardless of sentiment or history. The mansion is beautiful and historic and significant, and also practically useless to most people who might afford it. You can't eat nostalgia. You can't live on irony. The house is just a house, expensive and empty, waiting. But on certain quiet mornings, when frost covers the lawns and smoke rises from nearby chimneys, you can almost imagine an old man in a white suit walking these halls, planning his next move, defending his recipes, fighting battles he couldn't win against forces he'd unleashed by selling something he should have kept. Harlan Sanders bought Blackwood Hall to launch a comeback. He succeeded beyond his wildest imagination. And, in succeeding, he created something that eventually consumed him, profited from him, and legally prevented him from being anything more than a spokesman for his own modified legacy. That's the real story of Blackwood Hall. Not inspiration, but warning. Create something valuable enough, and eventually you'll face the choice of keeping it small and authentic or selling it for growth and losing control. Sanders chose growth. He got wealth, fame, and global impact. He also got legal battles, quality compromise, and the experience of watching billions of dollars in value get created from his recipe while he collected a salary and bit his tongue about wallpaper paste gravy. The mansion represents both outcomes. The ambition that built an empire, the powerlessness that comes from selling your name. The for sale sign still stands outside Blackwood Hall and the price keeps dropping, and the Colonel's face still appears on millions of chicken buckets worldwide. And somehow, both of these facts exist in the same universe, telling the same story from different angles. Success without control, wealth without ownership, legacy without power. The American dream, complicated,